The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered headstones of Springerville Cemetery, and Grace Whitman knelt beside a grave that did not belong to her family, placing fresh wildflowers against the simple wooden marker that read, Sarah Reynolds, beloved wife, 1848-1873. Garrett Reynolds stood 30 yards away, his worn leather hat pulled low against the Arizona sun, watching the young woman tend to his late wife's resting place with a tenderness that made his chest tighten in ways he had not felt since Sarah's passing 3 years prior. He came to this cemetery every Sunday morning without fail, always arriving before dawn to sit beside Sarah's grave and talk to her about the ranch, about the cattle, about the hollow ache that never seemed to leave his bones. But for the past month, he had noticed this stranger, this girl with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, arriving after him with flowers in her hands and tears in her eyes as she cleaned away the desert dust and spoke in whispers to a woman she could not have known. Grace did not know anyone was watching as she pulled weeds from around the grave's perimeter, her calico dress already dusty at the knees. She had been coming here since she arrived in Springerville 4 weeks ago, driven by a promise she had made to a dying woman on a stagecoach between Albuquerque and this dusty Arizona town. The woman had been older, perhaps in her 50s, traveling to visit family when illness overtook her during the journey. Grace had held her hand through the fever, through the delirium, through the final moments when the woman had grasped her wrist with surprising strength and whispered about a grave in Springerville that no one tended anymore, about a daughter-in-law named Sarah who had died too young, about flowers that should be placed there because family had scattered and the woman herself would not make it to Arizona alive. The woman had died 2 days before reaching Springerville, and Grace had continued alone, carrying the promise like a sacred duty. She had no family of her own anymore, no ties binding her to any particular place. Her parents had died of cholera when she was 16, and she had spent the past 3 years working as a seamstress in Santa Fe, saving every penny until restlessness drove her westward. At 19, she felt ancient in some ways and impossibly young in others, and the promise to a dying stranger gave her purpose in a world that had taken so much away. Garrett watched as Grace stood, brushing dirt from her dress, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he walked toward her, and she turned at the sound, her green eyes widening with something between alarm and curiosity. "I do not mean to startle you," Garrett said, his voice rough from disuse. He had not had a real conversation with anyone beyond necessary ranch business in longer than he cared to remember. "But I have been meaning to speak with you." Grace took a small step back, her hand moving instinctively to the small knife she kept hidden in her skirt pocket. A woman alone learned to be cautious. "I was just leaving." "Wait." Garrett removed his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with premature gray at the temples. He was 27 but looked older, carved lean and hard by grief and labor. "Sarah was my wife. This is her grave you have been tending." The fear in Grace's eyes transformed into something softer, sadder. "I promised someone I would care for it. A woman on the stagecoach from Albuquerque. She died before we reached Springerville, but she made me swear I would bring flowers here." Garrett felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening in a house that had been locked tight for years. That would have been Sarah's Aunt Martha. We received word she had passed during her journey west. We did not know there had been anyone with her at the end. "I am sorry for your loss," Grace said quietly. "Both losses." They stood in silence for a moment, the desert wind carrying the scent of sage and dust between them. A hawk circled overhead, its cry lonesome in the vast blue sky. "What is your name?" Garrett asked. "Grace Whitman." Garrett Reynolds. He turned his hat in his hands, suddenly feeling like a boy instead of a man who had fought Apache raiders and driven cattle through flood and drought. I come here every Sunday. I have seen you here these past weeks, and I wondered who you were. Why you cared for a stranger's grave. A promise is a promise, Grace said simply. And I suppose I understand what it is like to lose people, to want to know that they are remembered, that someone still brings them flowers. Garrett looked at her properly then, taking in the constellation of freckles across her nose, the stubborn set of her jaw, the sadness that lived behind her eyes like a permanent guest. She was beautiful in the way of wild things, untamed and honest, and something in him recognized something in her. "Would you allow me to walk you back to town?" he asked. "It is not safe for a woman alone out here. We have had trouble with drifters lately." Grace hesitated, weighing caution against instinct. There was something in this man's face that spoke of honor, of deep wells of grief that matched her own. All right. They walked together along the dusty road that led from the cemetery back toward Springerville's Main Street, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Garrett carried himself with the relaxed alertness of a man accustomed to danger, his hand never far from the Colt revolver at his hip, while Grace moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to pass through the world without drawing too much attention. "How long have you been in Springerville?" Garrett asked. 4 weeks. I have been working at the dress shop on Main Street. Mrs. Henderson needed help with alterations and sewing. Do you plan to stay?" Grace looked out at the landscape surrounding them, the red rock formations rising like ancient sentinels, the scrub brush and cacti that dotted the earth, the mountains purple in the distance. "I have nowhere else to go. This place is as good as any." Garrett heard the loneliness in those words, recognized it as the echo of his own. Sarah would have liked knowing someone was bringing her flowers. She loved wildflowers. Used to pick them every morning and put them in jars all around the house until our home looked like a meadow had exploded inside it. Grace smiled, and it transformed her face entirely. "The woman on the stagecoach, Martha, she told me about Sarah. She said she was kind. That she had a laugh that could light up a room. She did." Garrett's voice grew thick. "She died bringing our child into the world. The baby did not survive either. A son. I buried them together." Grace stopped walking, her hand reaching out instinctively to touch his arm. The gesture was brief, just a moment of connection, but Garrett felt it like a brand. "I am so sorry. That is a grief too heavy for words." "I have managed," Garrett said, though they both knew it was not entirely true. "The ranch keeps me busy. There is always work to be done." They continued walking, and Grace found herself asking questions she normally would not dare, drawn by something indefinable in this quiet cowboy who watched his wife's grave from a distance. He told her about his ranch 10 miles outside of town, about the 100 head of cattle he ran with the help of 2 ranch hands, about the land that had been in his family since his father had claimed it in 1860. He spoke of droughts and wolves, of the constant struggle to keep livestock alive in the harsh Arizona territory, of the loneliness that soaked into a man's bones when he lived so far from other people. In turn, Grace told him about Santa Fe, about the seamstress work that had kept her fed but never quite satisfied, about the restlessness that had driven her to pack everything she owned into a single carpet bag and board a stagecoach heading west. She spoke of her parents, of how cholera had taken them within days of each other, of the hollow ache of being the last of her line. By the time they reached Main Street, Garrett knew he wanted to see her again, wanted to hear more of her quiet voice and watch the way the sunlight turned her hair to copper flame. The realization terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "I would like to call on you," he said abruptly, the words tumbling out before he could question them. "If that would be acceptable, perhaps I could take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant." Grace looked at him, this tall cowboy with sad eyes and careful hands, and felt something stir in her chest that she had thought died with her parents. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of it. "I would like that. Saturday evening, then. I could meet you at the dress shop at 6. "Saturday at 6, Grace agreed. Garrett watched her walk into the shop, the bell above the door chiming her arrival, and he stood there for a long moment before turning back toward the livery where he had left his horse. His mind spun with thoughts he had not allowed himself in 3 years, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the future seemed like something other than an endless stretch of empty days. The week passed slowly for both of them. Garrett threw himself into ranch work with renewed energy, fixing fences and checking cattle, and trying not to think too hard about Saturday evening. His 2 ranch hands, old Miguel and young Tommy, noticed the change in him immediately. "You seem different, boss," Tommy said on Wednesday afternoon as they moved cattle to a new grazing area. "More alive or something." Garrett grunted non-committally, but Miguel, who had known him since he was a boy, saw straight through the deflection. "It is a woman, is it not? About time you started living again." "I am taking her to dinner on Saturday, that is all." Miguel grinned, his weathered face creasing with approval. "That is not all, and we both know it. Sarah would want you to be happy, Garrett. She would not want you spending the rest of your life talking to a headstone." The words stung because they were true. In his last conversation with Sarah before the birthing pains had begun, she had made him promise not to let grief consume him if anything went wrong. She had gripped his hand with both of hers and said, "Promise me you will live, Garrett, really live, not just exist." He had promised, and then he had broken that promise for 3 years straight. Grace spent her week sewing dresses and trying not to let her thoughts wander too often to Saturday evening. Mrs. Henderson, a sharp-eyed widow in her 50s, noticed her distraction by Tuesday. "You have been smiling at that hem for 5 minutes, dear," Mrs. Henderson said. "Care to share what has you so pleased?" Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "A gentleman has asked me to dinner." "A gentleman? In this town? That narrows it down to about 3 men." Mrs. Henderson set down her own sewing and leaned forward with interest. "Who is the lucky fellow?" "Garrett Reynolds." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted through surprise and into something warmer. "Now that is a good man. He has had a hard few years, that one. Lost his wife and baby in childbirth back in '73. Has been like a ghost ever since, just working that ranch and keeping to himself. If he has asked you to dinner, child, that means something." "I met him at the cemetery," Grace explained. "I have been tending his wife's grave." "You have been what?" Grace told the story of Martha on the stagecoach, the deathbed promise, the weeks of bringing flowers to Sarah's grave. Mrs. Henderson listened with the intensity of someone who understood the weight of such obligations. "You are a rare soul, Grace Whitman, Mrs. Henderson said when the tale was finished. "Most people would have forgotten such a promise the moment they reached town. Garrett Reynolds could use someone like you in his life." Saturday arrived with clear skies and temperatures that would bake the earth by midday, but were pleasant enough in the early evening. Grace spent extra time with her appearance, wearing her best dress, a deep green cotton that brought out her eyes, and had somehow survived the journey from Santa Fe without too much damage. She pinned her hair carefully, allowing a few curls to frame her face, and studied herself in the small mirror of her boarding house room with uncharacteristic vanity. Garrett arrived at the dress shop precisely at 6, wearing clean trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a vest that Grace suspected he only brought out for special occasions. He had shaved, and his hair was still damp from washing. He held his hat in his hands like a shield. "You look beautiful," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice made Grace's breath catch. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." They walked together to the Springerville Hotel, the finest establishment in town with its two-story structure and restaurant that served actual beef steaks instead of the dried meat that constituted most frontier fare. The dining room was half full, and Grace noticed the looks they received, the whispers that followed them to their table. A small town noticed everything, and Garrett Reynolds taking a woman to dinner was apparently news worth spreading. Garrett noticed too, and his jaw tightened. "I apologize for the attention. This town has little enough to talk about." "I do not mind," Grace said, and she meant it. She had grown accustomed to being invisible, the quiet seamstress who kept to herself. Being seen, being part of something that interested people, felt strangely validating. They ordered dinner and fell into conversation as easily as they had during their walk from the cemetery. Garrett asked about her work, about the dresses she made, about whether she enjoyed the craft. Grace told him about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw fabric, about the meditative quality of needle and thread, about the stories she imagined for the women who would wear her creations. In turn, Garrett spoke of the ranch with a passion that surprised them both. He described the land with a poet's eye, the way the sunrise painted the red rocks gold, the sound of cattle lowing in the evening, the sharp scent of pine from the mountains when the wind blew just right. He talked about the challenge of keeping a ranch profitable in territory that seemed determined to kill anything that tried to live there, about the satisfaction of building something lasting with his own hands. "You love it," Grace said. "The ranch, even with all the hardship." "I do," Garrett admitted. "It is in my blood, I think. My father used to say that some men are born to wander and some are born to put down roots. I am the second kind." "I think I might be too," Grace said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke. "I spent 3 years in Santa Fe feeling like I was waiting for something, like I was supposed to be somewhere else. I have only been in Springerville for a month, but it feels different here, like I could stay." Garrett reached across the table, his hand covering hers with a gentleness that belied his calloused palms. "I would like it very much if you stayed." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until the waiter arrived with their meals and the spell broke. They ate and talked, and by the time the sun had fully set and the restaurant had begun to empty, Grace realized she had not thought about her loneliness once all evening. The hollow ache that had lived in her chest since her parents' death had quieted, replaced by a warmth she had nearly forgotten existed. Garrett walked her back to the boarding house, their pace slow despite the darkness. The streets of Springerville were lit by oil lamps, casting pools of amber light at irregular intervals, and the saloon at the far end of town provided a distant soundtrack of piano music and raised voices. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Grace said as they reached her door. "As did I." Garrett hesitated, then forged ahead. "I would like to see you again. Perhaps you would consider coming out to the ranch next Sunday. I could show you the land and I make a decent enough lunch. I would like that very much." Garrett smiled, and it transformed his entire face, erasing years of sorrow in an instant. "Until Sunday, then." He tipped his hat and walked away, and Grace stood on the boarding house porch watching until he disappeared into the darkness. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beat rabbit quick beneath her palm, and allowed herself to hope. Sunday arrived bright and clear. Garrett came to town in his wagon rather than on horseback, and Grace appreciated the consideration as she climbed aboard, her skirts making horseback riding impractical unless absolutely necessary. They rode out of Springerville together, heading west on a dirt road that cut through the high desert landscape. The Reynolds ranch appeared gradually, announced first by fence lines and scattered cattle, then by a barn and several outbuildings, and finally by the house itself. It was a solid structure built of wood and stone, single-story but sprawling, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides and offered views of the surrounding land. Grace could see the care that had gone into its construction, the attention to detail that spoke of builders who had intended to create something permanent. "You built this?" she asked as Garrett helped her down from the wagon. "My father started it in '61, and I finished it after he passed. Added the porch and the eastern rooms about 5 years back, right after Sarah and I married." The mention of Sarah hung in the air between them, neither quite knowing how to navigate the presence of a ghost. Garrett cleared his throat and gestured toward the house. "Would you like to see inside?" The interior was neat but sparse, decorated with the functionality of a man living alone. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one, dominated by a large fireplace that would be essential during winter months. Grace noticed small touches that must have been Sarah's: lace curtains on the windows, a beautifully stitched quilt draped over the back of a chair, a row of empty glass jars on a shelf that would once have held wildflowers. "It is a good home," Grace said honestly. "Strong, built to last." "It gets lonely," Garrett admitted. "Miguel and Tommy stay in the bunkhouse, so I have help during the day, but the evenings are long." Grace understood loneliness intimately. She wandered through the room, her fingers trailing over surfaces, imagining what it would be like to live here, to wake to views of mountains and red rock, to have space and solitude, and the kind of peace that only came from being far from the noise of civilization. Garrett prepared lunch as promised: thick slices of bread with cheese and cold beef, apples from a tree that grew beside the house, water pulled fresh from the well. They ate on the porch, and he told her about the ranch's history, about the droughts that had nearly broken his father, about the year the Apache had raided and taken a quarter of their cattle, about the flood that had washed away an entire season's grazing land. But he also told her about the good years, about successful calving seasons and fair prices at market, about the satisfaction of slowly building something that would endure. After lunch, he saddled 2 horses, including a gentle mare named Rosie who had belonged to Sarah. Grace had limited riding experience, but Garrett proved to be a patient teacher, adjusting her posture and showing her how to communicate with the horse through subtle movements. They rode out across the property, Garrett pointing out landmarks and boundaries, and Grace felt something unfurl inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight for years. "It is beautiful here," she said as they paused on a ridge overlooking a valley where cattle grazed among scattered juniper trees. "Harsh, but beautiful." "It is honest land," Garrett said. "It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. I have always appreciated that." They rode back as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity. Garrett helped Grace down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary, and she looked up at him with eyes that reflected the sunset colors. "Thank you for today," she said. "I cannot remember the last time I felt so peaceful." "I would like you to come back," Garrett said. "Often, if you are willing. I know it is early and I do not wish to presume, but Grace, I have not felt this way since before Sarah died. You make me want to hope again." Grace reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, feeling the scratch of stubble against her palm. "I want to hope too, Garrett. I want to believe that losing everyone I loved does not mean I will always be alone." He kissed her then, softly at first, a question more than a demand. Grace answered by pressing closer, her arms winding around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of loneliness and longing and the desperate human need to be known by another person. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I should take you back to town before it gets full dark," he said reluctantly. "I suppose you should." The ride back to Springerville was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who had said what needed to be said and were content to exist in each other's presence. When Garrett left Grace at the boarding house, they made plans for the following weekend, and the weekend after that, and suddenly the future seemed full of possibility rather than empty of promise. The weeks turned into months, and Springerville watched as Garrett Reynolds courted Grace Whitman with a single-minded devotion that would have been romantic even if they had not both been so obviously healing from deep wounds. He came to town twice a week, and she went to the ranch every Sunday. They attended church together, sat through community dances, and took long walks through the countryside. Slowly, carefully, they built something real between them. Grace continued to tend Sarah's grave, and Garrett joined her now, the two of them bringing flowers together. It was Grace who suggested they plant roses beside the headstone, hardy desert varieties that could survive the harsh climate, and Garrett who spent hours digging and planting until the grave was surrounded by living beauty. It felt right, honoring Sarah while also acknowledging that life continued, that love could exist alongside grief without diminishing either. Mrs. Henderson had been right. Garrett was a good man, patient and kind and honest in ways that men often were not. He never pushed Grace to move faster than she was comfortable, never made demands she could not meet. In turn, Grace found herself opening up to him, sharing fears and dreams she had told no one, allowing herself to be vulnerable in ways that terrified and liberated her simultaneously. It was November when Garrett proposed, 6 months after that first meeting in the cemetery. He had planned something elaborate, a picnic up in the mountains where the aspens had turned gold, but in the end, the question came out one evening on his porch as they watched the sunset paint the world in fire colors. "Marry me," he said, the words simple and direct. "I know it has not been that long, but Grace, I do not want to spend another day without knowing you will be here, that this is permanent. I love you. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you kneeling beside Sarah's grave, caring for a stranger because you had made a promise. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Grace turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and nodded because words had momentarily failed her. When she finally found her voice, it came out thick with emotion. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Garrett Reynolds. I love you too. I think I have been looking for you my entire life without knowing it." He kissed her there on the porch, with the sunset as their witness, and Grace felt something slot into place deep inside her, like a bone that had been out of joint finally settling where it belonged. She was home, truly home, for the first time since her parents had died. They married in December of 1876, a small ceremony in Springerville's church with Mrs. Henderson and Miguel standing as witnesses. Grace wore a dress she had sewn herself, cream-colored silk that she had splurged on because a woman only married once, and Garrett wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. The preacher kept the service short, understanding that these were people who had already weathered enough hardship to know the value of what they were promising each other. The celebration afterward was larger, the entire town turning out for a dance and dinner at the hotel. Springerville was a community that celebrated weddings with enthusiasm, understanding that joy was precious in a place where life could be brutal and short. Grace danced with Garrett, with Miguel, with Tommy, with half the men in town, until her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. Garrett watched her with an expression of such complete contentment that several of the older women wiped away tears, remembering when he had looked at Sarah the same way and mourning the tragedy that had stolen those years from him. As the evening wound down and they prepared to ride back to the ranch, to the home that was now officially theirs together, Mrs. Henderson pulled Grace aside. "You have made that man whole again," she said. "I did not think I would live to see Garrett Reynolds smile like that. You are good for each other, child. Do not ever forget that." Grace hugged her fiercely, this woman who had been the first to show her kindness in Springerville, and whispered her thanks. The ranch house had been transformed during the week before the wedding. Garrett had cleaned and reorganized with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, and Miguel's wife Rosa had helped him add feminine touches, new curtains and quilts and small decorations that would make Grace feel welcome. When he carried her across the threshold, an old tradition he insisted on honoring, Grace laughed with pure delight at the sight of wildflowers in jars on every surface, an echo of Sarah, but also uniquely for her. Their wedding night was tender and nervous and ultimately perfect in the way of two people who loved each other enough to be patient through awkwardness. They lay together afterward, Grace's head on Garrett's chest, listening to his heartbeat and feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Garrett said into the darkness. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was finished, that I had used up my allotment of happiness." Grace propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. "Do you feel guilty for being happy with me?" Garrett considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes. But then I remember what Sarah said before the birthing started. She made me promise to live, really live, if anything happened to her. I think she would like you, Grace. I think she would approve of us." "I hope so," Grace said. "I will never try to replace her or erase her memory. She was part of your life, part of who you are. I can honor that. You are an extraordinary woman, Grace Reynolds." She smiled at the sound of her new name. "I like how that sounds, Grace Reynolds. It feels right." They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time in years, neither of them dreamed of graves or ghosts or the people they had lost. Grace settled into ranch life with surprising ease. She had worried she might miss the social aspects of town living, but the opposite proved true. The space and solitude felt like freedom after years of boarding houses and shared walls. She learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, rising before dawn to make breakfast for Garrett and the hands, spending her days tending the large garden she planted, caring for the chickens she insisted they needed, and continuing her sewing work for Mrs. Henderson, who sent projects out to the ranch weekly. She also learned to ride properly, progressing from the gentle Rosie to a spirited gelding Garrett bought for her at the spring horse market. She accompanied him on long rides across the property, learning to spot signs of illness in cattle, to identify the tracks of predators, to read the landscape the way he did. Miguel and Tommy accepted her with the easy warmth of men who were simply grateful to see their boss happy again. And she fed them well enough that they became fiercely loyal to her within weeks. The first year of marriage passed in a blur of small joys and mundane challenges. A late spring freeze killed half of Grace's garden and required replanting. A mountain lion took 3 calves before Garrett and Miguel tracked it down. Grace's sewing work became so sought after that she had to turn down projects, and she trained 2 young women from town in her techniques to help meet demand. Garrett bought 20 more head of cattle and began improving the breed by introducing a Hereford bull he had brought in from Colorado. Through it all, they grew closer, learning each other's quirks and habits, figuring out how to fight and make up, building the foundation of a partnership that was about more than just love. Grace discovered that Garrett became uncommunicative when stressed, retreating into himself, until she coaxed him back out with patience and humor. Garrett learned that Grace needed physical affection constantly, small touches throughout the day that reassured her she was not alone, and he adapted his natural reserve to meet that need. They visited Sarah's grave together on the anniversary of her death, bringing flowers and sitting in comfortable silence. Grace held Garrett's hand as he talked to his first wife, telling her about the ranch's progress, about how happy he was, about how he hoped she understood. Grace added her own words, thanking Sarah for the man she had loved and shaped, for the home she had helped build, for making Garrett promise to live. It felt right, acknowledging the past while also being secure enough in their present not to be threatened by it. Winter came early in 1877, bringing snow that was unusual for their part of Arizona. They had to bring the cattle closer to the ranch and supplement their feed with hay that Garrett had wisely stockpiled. The house became a warm cocoon, and Grace learned to make stews and bread and pies that would stick to a man's ribs through cold that seeped through walls. They spent evenings by the fireplace, Grace sewing while Garrett read aloud from books they borrowed from the circuit preacher's traveling library. It was during one of those evenings in late January that Grace realized her monthly courses had not come. She had been so busy with ranch life that she had not noticed immediately, but sitting there with Garrett's voice washing over her as he read from a collection of Poe's stories, the realization hit her with enough force to make her hands still on the shirt she was mending. "Are you all right?" Garrett looked up, noticing her sudden stillness. Grace met his eyes, her own wide with a mixture of joy and terror. "I think I might be pregnant." The book tumbled from Garrett's hands, forgotten as he crossed to her in 2 long strides. "Are you certain?" "Not entirely, but I am late, and I have been feeling strange in the mornings. I thought it was just something I ate, but now I wonder." Garrett knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers, and she saw fear flash across his face before he could mask it. He was remembering Sarah, remembering how childbirth had stolen both wife and son from him in a single terrible day. "We will get the doctor out here immediately," he said, his voice tight. "You will have the best care available. I will not lose you, Grace. I cannot lose you too." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You will not lose me. Women have babies every day, Garrett. I am young and healthy, and we will be careful. But you cannot spend the next 7 or 8 months terrified. That is not good for either of us." "How can I not be terrified?" His voice broke. "I love you more than I thought possible, and the idea of anything happening to you makes me want to keep you wrapped in wool and locked in this house until the baby is born." "That is not practical or healthy," Grace said gently. "We will be smart about this. We will get the doctor's advice, and I will be careful. But we also have to trust that life will work out, that not every story ends in tragedy." Garrett pulled her close, burying his face in her stomach where their child might be growing, and Grace held him, understanding that his fear came from love and loss in equal measure. The doctor confirmed the pregnancy 2 weeks later, estimating the baby would arrive in late August or early September. He assured them that Grace was in excellent health and saw no reason for concern, but Garrett insisted on a list of precautions and warning signs anyway. Grace bore his anxious hovering with patience, understanding that he needed time to work through his fear. As her pregnancy progressed, Garrett's anxiety gradually eased into excitement. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving intricate patterns into the wood during evening hours, and Grace sewed tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small. They argued good-naturedly about names. Grace favoring traditional family names while Garrett wanted something unique. Miguel's wife, Rosa, who had borne 6 children herself, became an invaluable resource, offering advice and reassurance to both of them. The pregnancy was mostly easy, though Grace suffered from terrible nausea during the first few months and developed odd cravings that sent Garrett on desperate rides to town for pickled vegetables and dried peaches. Her body changed, swelling with new life, and Garrett would spend hours with his hand on her stomach, feeling their child kick and move. "What do you hope for?" Grace asked one night as they lay in bed, her back pressed against his chest, his hand spread across her belly. "A boy or a girl?" "Healthy," Garrett said immediately. "That is all I care about, a healthy baby and a living wife." "Beyond that," Grace pressed, "if you could choose." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "A girl," he finally said. "A daughter with your eyes and your kindness. Someone I could spoil completely and teach to be as strong as her mother." Grace smiled in the darkness. "I think a boy would be nice. A son to help with the ranch, to carry on what you have built." "Then let us hope for twins," Garrett said, and Grace laughed until the baby kicked in protest at the jostling. Summer arrived with brutal heat that made Grace's pregnancy more uncomfortable. She moved slowly through her days, focusing on tasks that could be done in shade or early morning coolness. Garrett refused to let her do anything strenuous, taking over most of her usual chores himself, or assigning them to Tommy and Miguel. Grace complained about being treated like an invalid, but secretly she appreciated the care. August came, and with it the understanding that their child would arrive soon. Garrett brought the doctor out to the ranch to stay in the spare room, refusing to risk his wife's life because of distance. Rosa came too, bringing her wealth of birthing experience. Grace felt increasingly enormous and uncomfortable, her ankles swelling and her back aching, but underneath, the discomfort was an excitement that grew with each passing day. The labor started on a warm evening in late August, beginning with an ache in her lower back that Grace initially dismissed as normal pregnancy discomfort. When the contractions began in earnest several hours later, she woke Garrett calmly, refusing to panic. "It is time," she said simply. What followed was a long night and most of the next day. Garrett paced the porch like a caged animal while Rosa and the doctor attended Grace. He could hear her cries through the window, each one driving spikes of terror through his heart, and Miguel had to physically restrain him twice from bursting into the room. "Let the women work," Miguel said firmly. "Your job is to stay out of the way and trust them." "She is in pain," Garrett said, his voice raw. "She is suffering, and I can do nothing." "You can be strong when she needs you to be," Miguel replied. "You can be ready to meet your child and tell your wife how brave she was. That is what you can do." The baby's cry finally came just before sunset, a strong wail that pierced through the house and brought Garrett stumbling through the door before Rosa could invite him in. Grace lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, but she was smiling as Rosa placed a small bundle in her arms. "A boy," Rosa announced, "healthy and loud with a good set of lungs on him." Garrett crossed to the bed on shaking legs, looking down at his son with an expression of complete wonder. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect, his tiny fists waving in the air, his eyes squeezed shut against the lamplight. Grace looked up at Garrett with tears streaming down her face. "We have a son," she whispered. "Garrett, we have a son, and I am fine. We are both fine." Garrett sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his arm going around Grace's shoulders, his other hand reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small fingers. "He is beautiful. You are beautiful. I cannot believe you did this, that you brought him here safely." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. "We never did agree." Garrett looked at his son, at his wife, at the family that had seemed impossible just a year ago. "Samuel," he said, "after my grandfather, Samuel James Reynolds." "Samuel," Grace repeated, trying out the name. "I like it. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, little one." The doctor confirmed that both mother and child were healthy before departing the next day, and Rosa stayed for another week to help Grace recover and learn the basics of caring for a newborn. Samuel proved to be an easy baby, nursing well and sleeping in manageable stretches, though he had a temper when hungry that reminded everyone of his father. Garrett was completely besotted with his son, spending hours just watching him sleep or holding him carefully while Grace rested. He talked to Samuel constantly, telling him about the ranch, about the cattle, about how he was going to grow up to be a good man like his grandfather. Miguel and Tommy took turns visiting, bringing small carved toys and offering awkward congratulations. Grace recovered quickly, her youth and general health serving her well. Within a few weeks, she was back to her normal routine, though now with a baby strapped to her chest in a carrier Rosa had shown her how to make. Samuel went everywhere with his mother, learning the rhythms of ranch life from his first days of awareness. The town celebrated the birth enthusiastically, with half of Springerville finding excuses to ride out to the ranch bearing gifts and advice. Mrs. Henderson brought a beautiful christening gown that had been in her family for generations, and the preacher came specifically to bless the baby and offer thanksgiving that both mother and child had survived. As fall arrived and Samuel grew from newborn to infant, Grace watched Garrett transform once more. The shadow that had lingered in his eyes since Sarah's death finally disappeared completely, replaced by a contentment so profound it was almost visible. He would come in from working cattle to find Grace nursing Samuel by the fireplace, and the look on his face in those moments was pure joy. "I never thought I would have this again," he told her one evening, the words soft with wonder. "A family, children in this house. Laughter and hope instead of just silence and memory." "We will have more," Grace said confidently. "Samuel needs brothers and sisters, and I want this house full of life. Are you certain, after what childbirth put you through?" Grace shifted Samuel to her shoulder, patting his back until he released a satisfied burp. "It was difficult, but not unbearable, and the reward is worth it. Look at him, Garrett. Look at what we made together. How could I not want to do this again?" Over the next few years, they did exactly that. Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Emma in 1879, and then another son, Daniel, in 1881. Each pregnancy was easier than the last, and Garrett gradually learned to manage his fear, trusting in his wife's strength and the doctor's skill. The house filled with the sounds of children, with laughter and arguments and the constant motion of young lives learning about the world. The ranch prospered alongside their growing family. Garrett expanded their land holdings, buying out a neighbor who wanted to retire, and increased their herd to over 300 head. Grace's sewing business became a significant source of additional income, and she trained several young women from town, creating a small cooperative that could handle large orders. They built an addition onto the house, adding bedrooms for the children and a dedicated space for Grace's sewing. Life was not without its challenges. A drought in 1880 killed a quarter of their cattle and required them to dig deeper wells. Daniel was born sickly, and they spent a terrifying month nursing him through a fever before he finally turned the corner. Emma inherited her father's stubbornness and Grace's independence, a combination that led to epic battles of will. But through it all, they faced everything together, their partnership stronger with each year that passed. Grace continued to tend Sarah's grave, though less frequently now that her days were filled with living children. She brought the kids sometimes, teaching them to be respectful in cemeteries, explaining that their father had been married before, and it was important to honor that history. Samuel, old enough to understand at 5 years old, would carefully place flowers on the headstone and pat it gently. "Is she watching us from heaven?" he asked Grace once. "I believe so," Grace told him, "and I think she is happy to see what a wonderful family your father has now." Garrett overheard the exchange and pulled Grace close that evening, whispering his gratitude for a wife who understood that the past and present could coexist without conflict. The years continued their march forward. Samuel grew tall and lean like his father, taking to ranch work with enthusiasm. Emma proved to be a natural with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals. Daniel, the dreamer of the family, spent hours reading and drawing, his artistic soul at odds with ranch life, but loved no less for it. In 1885, Grace gave birth to their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Catherine after Grace's mother. The pregnancy at 29 was harder than the previous ones, and the birth was complicated enough that the doctor strongly advised against any future children. Garrett needed no convincing. He had 4 healthy children and a living wife, more than he had ever dared hope for after Sarah's death. The ranch continued to grow. By 1890, they employed 6 full-time ranch hands and owned over 500 acres. Garrett had become a respected voice in the territory's cattle industry, known for his fair dealing and quality stock. Grace's sewing cooperative had grown into a legitimate business that employed a dozen women and filled orders from as far away as Albuquerque. The children grew and changed. Samuel, at 14, was already working alongside his father like a full hand. Emma, at 11, could ride better than most grown men. Daniel, at 9, had filled countless sketchbooks with drawings of ranch life that caught details no one else noticed. Catherine, at 5, was a wild sprite who kept everyone on their toes with her constant energy and creativity. One evening in late summer of 1890, as Grace and Garrett sat on the porch watching the sunset with Catherine asleep in Grace's lap, Garrett turned to his wife with an expression of complete contentment. "You remember the day we met?" he asked. "When I walked up to you in the cemetery." "I thought you might be dangerous," Grace admitted with a smile. "A strange cowboy approaching a woman alone. I had my hand on my knife." "I thought you were an angel," Garrett said, "tending a stranger's grave because you had made a promise." "I knew then in some deep part of me that you were important, that you were going to change my life." "We changed each other," Grace said. "I was so lost when I came to Springerville. I had nowhere to go, no real purpose. And then I met you, and suddenly everything made sense. Suddenly I had a reason to stay, to build something, to hope for the future." Garrett reached for her free hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I love you more now than I did the day we married. I did not know that was possible, but every year with you, every challenge we face together, every child we raise, it just deepens. You are the center of everything, Grace. This family, this ranch, this life. It all revolves around you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too. More than words can properly express. You gave me a home, Garrett. Not just this house, but a place in the world where I belong. A family of my own after I thought I had lost the chance at that forever." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in impossible colors, their sleeping daughter warm in Grace's arms, their other children's voices drifting from inside the house, where Samuel was helping Emma with her arithmetic, while Daniel drew at the kitchen table. The ranch spread out around them, the land they had built a life on through sweat and determination and love. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Grace asked. "If Martha had not died on that stagecoach, if she had not made me promise to tend Sarah's grave, if you had not come to the cemetery that particular morning. All the time, Garrett admitted. It seems impossible that so much happiness could hinge on such random circumstances. But I choose to see it as fate rather than chance. You were meant to come to Springerville. I was meant to see you at Sarah's grave. We were meant to find each other. I like that interpretation, Grace said. It makes everything feel purposeful rather than accidental. As full darkness fell, and the children called that dinner was ready, Garrett and Grace rose together, moving in the synchronized way of long married couples who had learned to anticipate each other's movements. They walked into their home, into the warmth and light and noise of a house filled with life, and Grace sent a silent thank you to the universe, to Martha who had set her on this path, to Sarah who had made Garrett promise to live, to the mysterious workings of fate that had brought two lonely people together in a dusty Arizona cemetery. The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of children and the steady rhythm of ranch life. Samuel married at 20, bringing home a sweet-natured girl from town named Helen, and built a house on the eastern part of the property. Their first grandchild, a boy named Garrett after his grandfather, arrived in 1896, and Grace and Garrett found themselves stepping into new roles with joy. Emma surprised everyone by marrying a traveling photographer she met at a community dance, and she moved to Tucson where she helped run his studio while continuing to work with horses. Daniel left for college in California, the first in the family to pursue formal education beyond basic schooling, and he sent letters filled with ideas and observations that he illustrated with his careful drawings. Catherine, the baby of the family, showed signs of following in her mother's footsteps, taking to sewing and design with natural talent. Garrett's hair turned fully gray, and Grace found lines around her eyes and mouth that had not been there before, but neither minded. They had earned every mark of age, every sign that they had lived fully and loved deeply. The ranch remained prosperous, now run jointly by Garrett and Samuel, with plans for eventually passing it entirely to the younger generation. On a spring morning in 1900, Grace and Garrett rode together to the cemetery, something they still did several times a year. Sarah's grave was surrounded by the roses they had planted decades earlier, now mature bushes that bloomed prolifically. They sat beside it, and Grace told Sarah about the grandchildren, about Emma's adventures in Tucson, about Daniel's success at university, about Catherine's latest sewing project. "Thank you," Garrett said quietly when Grace finished, "for making me promise to live, for understanding that I could honor your memory while also loving again. You would like Grace. I think the two of you would have been friends." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had been her anchor for 24 years. They sat until the sun rose high, then rode back to the ranch together, ready to face whatever the new century would bring. The story of how they met became family legend, told to children and grandchildren with embellishments and laughter. The tale of a young woman who kept a promise to a dying stranger, of a grieving cowboy who found the courage to love again, of two lonely souls who built a life together out of chance and choice and stubborn determination. It was a story about second chances and the resilience of the human heart, about how sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected moments. As Grace and Garrett grew old together, their love deepened into something that went beyond passion or romance, transforming into a partnership so complete they could barely remember who they had been before each other. They watched their children raise families of their own, saw their grandchildren grow and scatter to new places and new adventures. The ranch continued on, a living testament to Garrett's vision and Grace's support, a place where family gathered and memories were made. In their 70s, they would sit on that same porch where Garrett had proposed, where they had watched countless sunsets and weathered metaphorical and literal storms. They held hands like teenagers, finishing each other's sentences, comfortable in a way that only came from decades of choosing each other every single day. "I would do it all again," Grace said one evening, her voice soft with the weight of years. "Every hard moment, every challenge, every fear. All of it just to end up here with you." "As would I," Garrett replied. "You saved my life, Grace. Not by pulling me from a river or stopping a bullet, but by showing me that grief does not have to be the end, that love can bloom even in the hardest soil, that keeping a promise to a dying woman could lead to everything worth having." Their story ended the way the best love stories do, not with dramatic declarations or grand gestures, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived and love well given. They left behind children who loved their partners deeply, grandchildren who understood the value of commitment and kindness, and great-grandchildren who would hear the story of how their great-grandparents met at a grave and fell in love. The ranch still stands, now worked by the fifth generation of Reynolds, and in the Springerville Cemetery, 3 graves sit side by side. Sarah's in the middle, flanked by Garrett and Grace, the roses they planted long ago still blooming every spring. It is a fitting memorial to a complicated truth, that love is not finite or exclusive, that the human heart has room for multiple stories, and that sometimes the greatest honor you can give someone who has died is to keep living fully, completely, and with every ounce of courage you can muster. And every spring, descendants of Garrett and Grace bring wildflowers to all 3 graves, honoring the woman who died too young, the man who found the strength to try again, and the woman who kept a promise to a stranger and found her home in the process. Because some stories are worth remembering, worth telling to each generation, worth preserving as a reminder that even in the harsh landscape of the Old West, even in the face of devastating loss, love could not only survive but thrive, blooming like roses in the desert, stubborn and beautiful and absolutely determined to live.